we are diving into some juicy history.
Okay.
Specifically, early Mormonism and the whole concept of plural marriage.
Okay.
So get ready, because things are about to get interesting.
Okay.
So, to really dig into this, we're focusing on a specific document, Section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants.
Right.
Now, this isn't just some random text. This is a big deal because it's presented as a revelation that Joseph Smith received back in 1843.
Wow. 1843.
And let me tell you,
Yeah.
this thing goes deep.
Yeah.
It's not just about marriage. It's about family. It's about what it even means to be exalted in the afterlife, like what happens after we die. We're talking eternal covenants, celestial glory.
Wow.
And yeah, you guessed it, the controversial practice of polygamy.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. We're not just going to read this section in isolation. We're going to look at it right alongside this super interesting diary entry from Joseph Smith himself, so we can really understand the context of what was going on, what people were thinking, what people were feeling, all that good stuff.
Yeah, because context is always important, right?
Oh, absolutely. Context is key. And what's fascinating is that Section 132, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. This was a time in early Mormonism when rumors about plural marriage were already kind of floating around, creating tension, drama. It's like a soap opera, but real life.
It makes you wonder, like, how much of that was formal doctrine and how much of it was just, speculation.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And we get a taste of that tension in Smith's diary entry, especially on July 12th, 1843, the day this whole revelation was written down.
Huh.
So picture this. Joseph's talking to his brother, Hiram.
Okay.
And they're discussing this whole plural marriage thing.
Okay.
And Hiram, he's like, dude, just tell Emma, write it down, it'll be fine. But Joseph, he seems hesitant, almost apprehensive. He even says to Hiram, you don't know Emma as well as I do. Like, he knows this isn't going to go over well. But despite his reservations, he dictates the whole revelation to his scribe, William Clayton.
Yeah.
They show it to Emma, and just like Joseph predicted, she is furious.
I can't imagine that went well.
Not even a little bit. The diary actually describes her as being incredibly angry, which honestly makes the whole situation so much more real, relatable even.
Yeah, for sure. It humanizes them, right? These weren't just figures in a history book. These were real people with real emotions navigating a really complex situation.
Totally. And it reminds us that even when you're talking about these huge theological concepts, these divinely inspired revelations, there's a human element that can't be ignored.
It's always there.
Always. And in this case, it's clear they were dealing with some seriously heavy stuff, like a revelation that just straight up challenged the very core of how they understood marriage and family. And in a society where those boundaries were not up for debate,
Right, like challenging the status quo like that, it would have been unthinkable to many.
Exactly. So let's actually dive into the content of Section 132 itself. It starts off with what appears to be God directly addressing Joseph Smith.
Okay.
And then it goes into these questions that Joseph supposedly had about some Old Testament figures like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of whom, by the way, practiced polygamy.
Right.
But here's where things get really interesting. This section doesn't just talk about these ancient practices. It goes on to lay out this whole new and everlasting covenant.
Okay.
And it claims that this covenant is absolutely essential for anyone who wants to enter God's glory, which makes you wonder, what exactly makes this covenant so new?
That is the question, right? Like, how does it differ from how Christians traditionally viewed covenants?
Exactly. And it's not shying away from big claims either.
Yeah.
Like it states, then shall they be gods, because they have all power and the angels are subject unto them.
Wow. So it's suggesting that by following this new covenant, people can actually become like God, right? Not just live with him in heaven, but reach a whole other level of existence.
It's a pretty bold statement, and one that has huge theological implications. What do you make of that?
I mean, it really gets at the heart of Mormon theology, right? This concept of exaltation, which is often debated even today. It's not just about going to heaven. It's about inheriting all that God has, becoming like him, a co-creator for eternity. It's about infinite potential.
And according to Section 132, eternal marriage isn't just some nice bonus in this whole framework. It's a requirement.
Wow.
It has to be sealed by the Holy Spirit and follow God's specific laws. Which brings us to the crux of the issue, plural marriage.
It's all connected.
Totally. And understanding the weight of that, we need to get a grasp on how they viewed sealing, because it's not just a wedding ceremony. It's this ritual that's meant to bind people for eternity with implications that last well beyond this life.
Yeah, that's a powerful concept.
It is, and it's at the center of this whole revelation. So here we have these massive concepts: eternal marriage, exaltation, this new and everlasting covenant, all intertwined with plural marriage, which, as Joseph Smith claimed, was authorized by God through his authority as a prophet.
A lot to unpack there.
Absolutely. And then the story takes a turn, right? Remember Emma's reaction to all of this?
Oh, yeah, she was not.
Understatement of the century. So, according to the diary, after she read this revelation, she was so furious that Joseph actually let her destroy the original manuscript.
Wait, what? He just let her destroy it?
It seems so. I guess maybe he thought it would calm her down.
Wow.
But ever resourceful, he just rewrote the entire thing from memory.
The whole thing from memory.
From memory, imagine that. And then a scribe made a copy of that rewritten version, and that's what we have today as Section 132.
So the question is, did anything change? I mean, rewriting something that long from memory, there's bound to be some differences, right?
Right. It makes you wonder, could there have been unintentional changes? Did Emma's reaction, her anger, did that somehow subconsciously influence how he remembered and rewrote the revelation?
It's impossible to know for sure, but it definitely adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. So now we're left with this bombshell revelation, a furious wife, a destroyed manuscript, and a whole lot to unpack.
You know that phrase, by me, when it talks about marriage?
Oh yeah, marry her not by me.
What do you think is the significance of that?
Well, it all goes back to this idea of priesthood keys, which is so central to Mormonism.
Okay.
So they believe that Joseph Smith, as the prophet, he held these special keys, right?
Okay.
And these keys gave him the authority to perform these eternal sealings.
Oh, interesting. So it's like he was acting on behalf of God, basically.
Exactly.
Oh.
Like a conduit of God's power here on earth. So it's not just about any marriage. It has to be this specific type of marriage, enacted through this very specific authority to even matter in the afterlife, according to this revelation.
Right, and that's what gives it that eternal weight. These priesthood keys, they weren't just for marriage, they were for all sorts of ordinances.
Yeah.
Baptism, confirmation. It's like they believed these rituals had real power.
Real lasting power.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Which brings us to that passage that directly addresses Emma Smith. But if she will not abide this commandment, she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord. For I am the Lord thy God, and will destroy her, if she abide not in my law.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
Those are some really strong words. What do you think about how those words have been interpreted, especially knowing how much Emma struggled with this idea of plural marriage?
It's one of those passages that people continue to debate and discuss, even today.
Oh, I bet.
I mean, think about it. Emma Smith, she was right there from the beginning, helping to shape Mormonism. It's impossible to separate this revelation from their relationship, you know what I mean?
Totally. It adds this whole other layer of complexity.
It does. And some people, they see that passage as a reflection of just how much pressure she was under, how difficult this revelation must have been for her personally.
Because it wasn't just theological for her. It was her life.
Exactly. But then there are others who interpret it more literally as a conditional statement about obedience to divine law.
No matter what, no matter your personal feelings.
It really highlights that struggle between personal belief and what you believe God is commanding you to do, which is a common theme throughout a lot of religious texts, really.
Right. The tension between what you want and what you're told is right.
Exactly.
And speaking of commands and consequences, there's that section that addresses adultery pretty head on. It says, if a man receiveth a wife in the new and everlasting covenant, and if she be with another man, and I have not appointed unto her by the holy anointing, she hath committed adultery and shall be destroyed. It's really harsh language. How do you reconcile that with the idea of a loving and merciful God? It seems like a question a lot of people grapple with when they're trying to make sense of religious texts.
Absolutely. It's a question that people have been wrestling with for centuries.
Right.
And there are a lot of different interpretations out there, even within Mormonism. Some people believe that kind of language should be understood metaphorically.
Instead of literally being destroyed.
Right. Like, it's more about the spiritual consequences of turning away from God's path.
So it's about understanding the language within the context of that specific belief system.
Context is everything.
Right.
And, you know, even within Section 132 itself, there are glimpses of empathy and understanding for human emotions, despite these very firm rules and pronouncements.
Like what?
Well, there's the passage right after the one about Emma potentially facing destruction. It says, and again, verily I say unto you, let mine handmaid forgive my servant his trespasses, and then shall she be forgiven her trespasses, wherein she hath trespassed against me.
So it almost sounds like it's commanding Emma to forgive Joseph. presumably for practicing plural marriage.
Right, which, as we know, caused major tension in their relationship.
Totally. And that's what makes it so fascinating to me. Because it wasn't just about their personal relationship, it was about the foundation of this whole movement.
It was intertwined with everything.
Exactly, which makes that command to forgive even more powerful, right? Because it's acknowledging the very human toll this was taking on their relationship.
And it kind of puts Emma in a tough spot, right?
Totally. And it makes you think about the expectations placed on women within this whole religious structure.
Especially women in positions of authority, which Emma definitely was.
That's a great point.
And that leads us to another passage that tends to spark some debate. And again, verily, verily, I say unto you, if any man have a wife who holds the keys of this power, and he teaches unto her the law of my priesthood as pertaining to these things, they then shall she believe and administer unto him, or she shall be destroyed.
Wow. Okay. So this one seems to be suggesting that a woman, if she holds priesthood keys, which was a pretty radical idea back then, has to support her husband's practice of plural marriage or face dire consequences.
Yeah, this passage is a lot.
It really makes you think about the roles of men and women, especially in a religious context. What are your thoughts?
Well, on the one hand, it seems to reinforce a pretty traditional patriarchal structure.
Right.
But then there's that phrase, a wife who holds the keys of this power.
It's like a contradiction almost.
Right. It suggests that women can possess spiritual authority, which is something that people still discuss and debate within Mormonism today.
So even within this passage that seems to be reinforcing traditional gender roles, it's hinting at something more.
Exactly. And it raises all sorts of questions about agency and obedience, especially within a marriage that's supposed to be eternal.
Eternal and divinely ordained, no pressure. It's a lot to unpack, and I think it really speaks to the broader challenge of interpreting these religious texts.
Trying to balance historical context with how our own values have evolved over time.
Exactly.
It's a conversation that goes way beyond just section 132. It's about the nature of faith itself and how we make sense of these ancient texts in our modern world.
Well said. Okay, so we spent all this time unpacking section 132, but let's be real for a second.
Yeah.
How does this 19th century revelation about plural marriage, how does that even make sense in the 21st century?
Right, especially considering the main branch of Mormonism officially stopped practicing polygamy over a century ago, back in 1890.
Exactly. So how do we square that circle?
Yeah.
On one hand, you have this document saying plural marriage is basically a commandment from God.
Right.
And on the other hand, you have millions of Mormons today living in monogamous relationships.
It's definitely something that makes you think, right? How do those two things coexist?
For sure. So how do people reconcile those two things?
Well, it's not about ignoring this document or pretending it doesn't exist. It's more about understanding that religious thought isn't static. It evolves. It changes over time.
That makes sense. We see that across a lot of different religions, right?
Absolutely. Interpretations of sacred texts can shift as society changes and as we gain a deeper understanding of our own history.
So how does that apply to Section 132 specifically?
Well, a lot of Mormons today, they see this revelation as a product of its time, meaning it reflects the social and cultural norms of the 19th century when it was written.
Okay, so they're acknowledging the historical context.
Exactly. And they focus on the core principles that are still relevant today, like the emphasis on eternal marriage and the importance of family.
But within the framework of monogamy.
Exactly. They believe those principles can be honored and lived out in monogamous relationships.
So, while they no longer practice plural marriage, those core values about eternal families and achieving exaltation, those are still super important.
Right. It's like they've taken the core message of eternal families and applied it to a modern context.
And that's how they reconcile the text with how they live their lives today.
It highlights how dynamic faith can be, it's always adapting and evolving.
Holding on to those central beliefs.
Yeah.
While also navigating a world that's constantly changing.
Mm.
And it reminds us that interpreting these religious texts, especially ones from a different time period, it requires nuance.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's about understanding where people were coming from back then, but also recognizing how our own understanding has evolved.
Definitely. And, I think even though Section 132 has these controversial parts, it still gives us this really valuable window into the minds and hearts of those early Mormons.
What do you mean?
Well, you can see their longing for a connection to the divine, their belief that they could progress and become like God, and you can see their willingness to grapple with some really challenging ideas in their pursuit of truth.
It reminds us that they were real people trying to figure things out, just like us.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I have one final thought. If this document really is a direct communication from God, as it claims to be, how do we reconcile some of its more, shall we say, challenging aspects with our modern sensibilities? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer, but it's one worth pondering.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of these deep dives, right? They spark more questions than answers, which keeps us curious and keeps the conversation going.
Exactly. And on that note, until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.